So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Brodies Planning Live. I'm Karen Hamilton, and I'm a partner in the planning team here at Brodies. Joining us this afternoon, I am quite delighted to have Neil Collar, who is one of our planning partners and head of the team here, our Brodies, well known to everybody, I'm sure. And we have Alex Orr from Orbit Communications and our own Johanna Boyd, who is a barrister and associate in our government regulation and competition team. Now, just a bit more detail on our guests. So I'm sure Alex will be known to very many of you, but Alex is Managing Director of Orbit Communications. He's one of Scotland's leading PR practitioners and has extensive experience of undertaking communications for some of the most complex planning applications in Scotland. Those have included successfully supporting the delivery of Scotland's first commercial gold mine, something which we might know just a little bit about at Brodies too. I'll not ask Alex if he ended up on Harry Hill's TV burp as Neil did. And also a variety of residential, commercial and mixed-use developments. And he's pioneered the delivery of digital community consultations, and the team at Orbit have now undertaken over 100 of those, Alex tells me. So a bit more on Johanna's background. So as well as being a colleague and a barrister, as I've mentioned, Johanna was the first woman to lead Stirling Council and the youngest council leader in Scotland at that time, back in 2012 through to 2017. And during that time, Johanna secured the Stirling and Clackmannanshire City Region deal, £214 million worth, which involved cross-party political lobbying of UK government and Scottish government, as well as working collaboratively with the private sector and university. She also was involved in the delivery of the £35 million Stirling Care Village, a multitude of new schools, nurseries and new council homes, and introduced the living wage at Stirling, which closed the gender pay gap. So all very interesting and exciting stuff. And I think it just shows you we're in for an interesting discussion this afternoon. So our topic, I should have mentioned already, is councillors and the planning system, hence our guests this afternoon. I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. But before we launch into that, we thought we would test the water with everybody, make sure everyone's awake, get you thinking with a quick fire poll. So that should just be coming up on your screens now, or just shortly. There you have it. So don't need to think too hard about this, but the question is, should planning decisions be made by councillors or a panel of planning experts? So fingers on those buttons. You can see people are just taking the time quickly to vote. So maybe that's something that we'll come back to in the discussion later on. Just give it a couple of seconds before I read out the results. Everyone's waiting with bated breath. Okay, so I think we've called a halt to the voting, and out of 93 responses, we have 37% who say that councillors should be making the planning decisions in Scotland, and a whopping 66% are saying that those decisions should be made by a panel of planning experts. So I think that sets this afternoon's discussion off on a pretty interesting, perhaps controversial footing. So with that, I will hand over to Neil to lead us through some discussion with Alex and Johanna.
Thanks very much, Karen. And just to note in passing, a fair chunk of applications are decided by officers under delegated powers, but we're not really looking to do a lot of lecturing, as it were, today. It's very much intended to be a discussion. So those of you who turned up expecting a Brodies PowerPoint webinar teach-in. It's not, it's a chat. But hopefully we're not going to get a huge fall-off in participants.
Numbers will drop down now, Neil.
I know. The chat's going to be much more exciting than the PowerPoint presentation ever could have been. So what we wanted to do was to start just at the general level of councillors and councillors interacting with the planning system. And when we're thinking about councillors deciding planning applications, that is a quasi-judicial role, and that's as very much as lawyers putting our lawyer hat on and contextualising from the beginning. And Johanna, just starting with you, do you think councillors are well enough equipped to make those decisions, to have that quasi-judicial role, given all the complexities that we know and love about planning law and policy? We can't avoid it. It's damn complicated.
It certainly is, Neil, and I think often the volume of information that's going in front of councillors, the complexity of policies, the evidence that underpins all of that, the expertise, if it's a complex planning application, and it might be to do with a wind farm with lots of technical information that's supporting it. So I think it is a demanding role, but as you've already mentioned, it is that sitting like a judge, that quasi-judicial role. And what the code tells us, so I think there was a new code for councillors at the end of last year, and that really is flagging to councillors, look, this is an important role should you find yourself sitting on the planning committee, and you have to be, I think the words that are used are especially vigilant. So things like principles around fairness, acting impartially, not being seen to prejudge an application, all of those things come into play. And for me, I think training is therefore absolutely critical, particularly for a new councillor. And I think what happens when you come in and everyone's very excited to get started and get going, you might want to have a place on the planning committee, you may not. You might find yourself on it without having had a preference one way or another, but the training tends to happen up front. But I think there's so much training going on. You'll be getting a qualities training. You'll be trying to understand governance. If you've got a portfolio, you'll be trying to get to grips with that. And then you've got this very niche, very specialist, very complex area that you have to get to grips with. And I think training shouldn't just be upfront and at the start. It should be, in my view, it should be ongoing. It should be annual. And whether you're on the committee or not, I think it should be for all elected members. So yes, I think it's, there's so much at play there. Also, it's important to say that councillors, if they are sitting on the planning committee, they're supposed to take into account planning officer advice. That's also set out in the code. So even if they're minded not to take the advice, they are supposed to consider it in that impartial and unbiased way. So those are my sort of initial thoughts on it, but it certainly is a demanding role.
Yeah, and Alex, I'll come to you in a minute, but just to pick up on a couple of points there, I think it is really important, that comment about the councillor role is much more than just planning, and you were talking about it in the context of training for the newbies, as it were. But I think that's so important to realise that for a councillor who's on the planning committee, it is only a part of what they do, and those of us involved directly in planning, I think we tend to forget there's other stuff, and actually the other stuff, to some people, shotgun or gasp, might be even more important than planning. On the training, again, just to do the lawyer thing, I did check up the training provisions in the Planning Act have not been brought into force, and as far as I could tell, there isn't an indication yet of when they will be brought into force. So that's still sitting there waiting to be activated. Alex, Johanna mentioned there about the volume of information, the complexities, and that made me think that's probably partly your job in talking to councillors, is actually finding out, is there anything that they're struggling with? How do you communicate to them? I mean, how do you find that? Do you find that councillors struggle with those complexities of planning and that you really need to help them with that?
Well, absolutely, Neil. And I think you've quite rightly, Johanna, and both yourself pointed out the issue relating to training and the need for training, both at the beginning of the process if it's a newbie, but also throughout that whole process. But I think those that are developers on this call will be aware that it's not only the development that those councillors are dealing with. They are dealing, as Johanna's quite rightly pointed out, with a raft of issues. They could be on the education committee. They could have a portfolio. They'll also be dealing with their constituency business, so the business within their ward, but they'll also have issues relating to potential employment as well. So they may also have a job in addition to that. So there's a huge amount of information coming through, and the role, and there's a need to sort of simplify and get that information across to them about what maybe the benefits of the development are in quite a simple basis that they will get to understand, because very few will be experts, very few will be coming from a planning or architectural background. So you need to break down that information to very simple terms as to what the benefits are of the development in that community, what the merits are of that development, and also being able to deal with any criticisms that they may be hearing as well within the local area too. So that's often what you're trying to do. And an issue we may come to later in dealing with councillors is trying to get an understanding of what makes them tick. What are the issues that they find of interest? What are the buttons you need to press with them, both in advance of a committee, but also at a committee as well, if they happen to be councillors sitting on that planning committee.
I think as well, just on the back of what Alex has said, there's a point there about language.
Yeah.
And that, you know, if you are in the planning world, you will understand what an LDP is, what a material consideration is, all of this language and jargon that goes along with it. And I certainly found that when I first came onto the council, the planning language, I got that. That was part of my legal background. Social care, that was a whole new language. Education, that was a whole new language. And there is that point within the council that you're trying to understand the language that is used by officers, by the experts. And if you're not familiar with the language of planning and planning law, that's a first thing that's excluding you from understanding the issues. So absolutely, as Alex has mentioned, communication is key, simple communication.
I think to recount that story, which was quite an amusing one, at the beginning of, or following the last local government election, when there was the first planning committee, one of the councillors on it was aghast that there was a PPP application. He was a new councillor and couldn't understand that the council supporting PPP. He had thought it was the private finance initiative, as was not planning permission in principle. So this is where there was a lack of understanding, a lack of knowledge, a lack of awareness, and there's an incredibly steep learning curve to take people who come from a potentially having little or no understanding of planning into an environment with all the jargon, as you've quite rightly highlighted, and bringing them up to speed. And whether the training that councils do at the moment is enough, that's a different question, but certainly training both at the beginning and along that way has to be an essential part of that process, which I suppose why that question was thrown out at the very beginning about planning decisions. And should planning decisions be taken by councillors? Do they have the knowledge and expertise? Is the system too politicised for them to do that? Should it be taken by planning experts, or should it be taken by a hybrid of both maybe?
And actually, this wasn't planned, honest.
It wasn't.
That's what I was coming on to. We're not quite that good at organising all of this. But Johanna, you mentioned in passing the issue about councillors deciding contrary to recommendation. And that is a really important issue in our system. I was speaking at an event yesterday, Scottish Renewables were running, and I was talking about how we don't have a rigid zoning system. There's a lot of discretion given to the decision makers in this context, the councillors. They get a recommendation from their professional planners. We're going to come on and talk about councillors and officers in a minute, but that is only a recommendation, and in law, they are not required to follow it. Yes, they need to give reasons for their decision, and if they decide to refuse permission contrary to the recommendation, there is an appeal possibility. The interesting thing is not every one of those refusals contrary to recommendation is rejected by a reporter on appeal. So sometimes the reporter, the Scottish Government reporter who decides the appeal, agrees with the councillors and disagrees with the officers, which I suppose says something about planning as well, but that's for another day. But does that sort of context, in your view, show that the checks and balances in the system generally work? And do you as an ex-councillor feel that it is important that councillors have that opportunity to disagree with the professional advice?
I think it's absolutely critical, isn't it? It's democracy in action. But I think the important point is that if you are going to disagree with your expert planning officer, and I think it's important to acknowledge that expertise, then you need to be confident that you're doing it for sound, justifiable, defensible reasons. Otherwise, you're exposing your council to reputational harm and potentially to an award of costs against the council for unreasonable behaviour. And I think it's important that those decision-making processes that then lead into those legal processes are also understood. So again, there's another layer of complexity that you're also asking elected members to understand, not just the policy context, and we haven't really touched on, for example, the development of an LDP. That's again a separate sort of process to how do you determine a planning application. And then the sort of legal processes that can kick in where there are legal challenges. And of course, we know that those are many and varied and always interesting. But as you say, Neil, they can come out in both senses, i.e. for the developer or in defence of the decision taken by those elected members. But I think it all links back into, as I said at the start, that democratic process, because I know many elected members who were elected on the basis of campaigns around planning related issues. So again, I'm sure we'll come on to talk about that in terms of the code and what you can and can't say and when you have to then withdraw from those decision-making processes. But that is the decision-making part of those sort of statements made at the election process. And of course, we've got an election coming up. And I'm sure for many people on the call, there'll be many issues in their local communities that they will expect those candidates to be taking positions on in the run-up to those elections.
I've always wondered, it's interesting in addition to that, if there should be not more reflection back from the officers to councillors to explain the costs of taking something to an appeal. When an office where recommendations come through that's almost watertight in terms of going to the committee, the issues become politicised, councillors then refuse it, often in a blasé manner. It then goes to the Scottish Government who just effectively reject the refusal and go with a recommendation. If it's worthwhile, and I've seen some councillors do it, where they've said, look, we could take this to appeal, but we're going to lose it. And I wonder if there's not more that should be done in reflecting back to councillors the costs of taking something to appeal and the impact on the council of that, because you don't really see that happening. And I wonder if that would help in the decision-making process.
Yeah, I think there's that's perhaps something that's best done, I would say, not in open committee, because of course you need to be thinking about, what are proper planning reasons for refusal in terms of that application. But I think it's a very demanding thing for the officers, as you say, Alex, where there is a very clear recommendation in the report, and then there's a discussion. Those officers have got to capture that discussion and then ensure that the reasons that are given are ones that are capable of standing up to scrutiny further down the legal process. So I think the issue of costs can almost cut both ways as well. If someone is absolutely determined to see a particular outcome and that has cost money, then I think that can be used almost as a flag to wave as much as it can be as something to be concerned over. Although you're absolutely right to flag it, because it is in terms of reputation, you know, there is a duty in the code on councillors to be thinking about not making statements that might bring the council into disrepute or acting in a way that might bring it into disrepute. So those are considerations that should be at the forefront of elected members' minds.
Yeah, yeah.
We're knocking off a lot of the key issues, which is great. So moving it on, and Alex, this is a bit of a biggie. Planning is not supposed to be political. Definitely not party political. We are told there is no whipping along party lines, but quite often we can look at the decision and feel that it is split on party political lines. And what's your feeling around that? Is that just pure coincidence? Is there an element of consensus within a political group? Is it something that we should be worried about, or actually is it really just by the time it gets to a decision, it is what it is, and actually it's not necessarily a problem?
It's different in different councils, Neil, and some councils will take that role very seriously. Other councils, there is such a, dare I say, a coincidence between the way a group votes opposing the other group, that it goes more beyond coincidental, and there's an element of potentially giving that group a bloody nose. And that will become really evident, especially in the run-up to elections, as we are at the moment, where you can now definitely see coalescing in councils around that issue, which is becoming really strong in terms of, you know, this is recommended for approval. We're maybe going along with officer recommendation as we see it as an administration, but yet we have the opposition groups, because they see it as populist, potentially garnering votes, etc., to oppose that. So I think, to me, it goes beyond that individual basis of operating a quasi-judicial role, and it becomes more group aligned and very much partisan aligned in that element.
I think our listeners today are certainly agreeing with those views expressed. There's perhaps a fair amount of chuckling going on at the idea of planning being apolitical, and I think Tony Thomas is remarking that you can see the politics playing out at times during the actual committee discussion and debate itself, which I'm sure will be an experience that many of us can recognise. But if I can perhaps just jump in with a question that has been raised, and it's maybe slightly jumping ahead, Neil, but there's a definite interest in how members should be behaving pre-application. I know that's probably a topic that you're keen to get on to. How members should be engaging pre-application with applicants or others who are interested in applications, and indeed how far they can go. And I suppose experiences of different practices, because it seems fairly clear that different practices do occur at different councils, regardless of what you may be able to legitimately do in terms of the code.
Yeah, so picking that up, Johanna first, maybe. I find myself quite often talking about lobbying of councillors, and then I thought, hang on a minute, lobbying's a bit of a loaded term. It suggests something a little bit negative, shall we say. So I'm trying to school myself to talk about engagement, but hey. But getting beyond that, whether it's lobbying or whether it's engagement, do you, as an ex-councillor, feel that it is a useful way for councillors to know what's going on in the area, or do you feel there's something slightly distasteful, slightly necessary evil about it?
Well, I think you're right about it being a loaded term, Neil, but I think maybe the word I would use is you're being influenced or influencing, engaging. I think those are, and that I think is happening all the time. So if you're an elected member and you're turning up at your local community council, they will be sharing their views about, and they will be you could call that lobbying, trying to influence you, trying to get you to agree with a particular line that may be taken within that community council. So I think that the elected members are very aware and familiar with that, whether it's going to the third sector, whether it's engaging with businesses, whether it's lobbying yourself, going off to speak to Scottish Government or UK Government about investment. So I think that is happening all the time. I think where it's a more obvious thing, like that there is a business and they have a planning application, where I've had experience of that, it has been in a more controlled and cross-party way. So if you were being invited to meet with a business, that, and again, that's fair, and it gives protection across those political parties. You're all being invited. You may have an officer with you, you may not, and it's very clear what's going on. And I think that can be very helpful. If you're being shown around a particular business, how it operates, what the investment is, what the workforce is, I think that can be it's part of the education, isn't it, about your community and what's going on within your community. Just in the same way, you might be going around and speaking to local residents and being walked into their back garden and being shown, this is how that development is going to impact on me. This is where my garden floods. So I think that is all legitimate and what you would expect to take place. I think what's interesting is the pre-application, what elected members can and can't say, what they might have said during the election process about a particular development, and then the impact that then has if they're sitting on the planning committee as to whether they should be involved in the decision-making process or not. And so if there are examples given in the guidance from the Standards Commission about that, so if you come out and say something like, I am completely against wind farms during an election, I would never ever want to see any wind farm built in X area, then it's quite very clear, isn't it? You should not be deciding on any application about a wind farm. But if you said something like, generally I'm against that, I would need to be persuaded of the benefits, then I think you're into more of a grey area, and you could then sit and determine that planning application. But it is, and again, that's where your officer's advice is absolutely critical as to whether or not you could be said to have prejudged or predetermined or be biased against a particular planning application.
Yeah, and Alex, as Karen mentioned, Andrew, who put in the question, was talking about different areas, different approaches, and certainly I've had some feedback that different officers in different areas will tell councillors different things about how or whether they should be engaging with developers. And what's your experience in that?
Yeah, very much so. There's certainly one or two councils I'm aware of where the recommendation from the officer to the councillors has been not to engage at all with developers. In fact, it's an issue that I've taken to Scottish Government because I was concerned because they weren't engaging with anyone at all in relation to that. And I felt that was anti-democratic, because lobbying, be lobbying by a community council or lobbying by a developer, is a valid part of the democratic process. There are other councils where some councillors just won't meet. Some will meet. Some will meet with you right up to the application being submitted, and then we'll draw back from not meeting. And then others who will meet, we're happy to meet in that process. So it's often, to be honest, horses for courses. There's no one size fits all rule, Neil, and it often comes down to individuals. And if you've built up an individual relationship with a councillor who is happy to meet, then all well and good. But that there's no standard rule or standard practice. It seems to be up it all over the shop.
Yeah, and I suppose to pull that together, the one thing that is clear is the code of conduct doesn't stop councillors having those meetings, as Johanna was saying. It's about what do they say. Yeah. And if they're careful about basically saying, I'm in listening mode, I'm not committing myself to anything, then the code says that is perfectly appropriate. And I think there's some misunderstanding around about oh, you shouldn't be. And well, the code says, yes, you can, if you're careful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's probably fair to say that there would be a fair amount of misunderstanding of that amongst members of the public as well, who may often feel that there is something untoward happening when in fact that isn't the case, as well as potentially members' own nervousness.
Yeah.
I think
yeah. Sorry,
Sorry,
Johanna.
Neil. Sorry, no, I was just going to say about the blanket statement. I think that's always to be avoided for any elected member, you know, particularly if you're on the planning committee, saying anything like, I would never allow an application that wasn't in accord with the development plan, or something like that. You know, that's just opening yourself up. Because as you've already pointed out, Neil, it's all about the planning balance, isn't it? And you can have justifiable reasons for going one way on an application, but the committee can decide something else, and you could find that is actually agreed with by a reporter. So it just shows that there's decisions can go one of two ways, but coming out with blanket statements, I think, is always putting an elected member in the risk zone.
Yeah, and this is extremely important or interesting coming up to elections, where you will have a lot of councillors campaigning on local issues, who then you may find, it's a point I think you raised earlier, Joanna, who then they find themselves on the planning committee, and then you have to hold up the bit of paper, whatever, say, well, hang on a minute, you've just been campaigning against X, and now you're sitting on a committee. You know, is that something you may want to consider? Yeah, and this happens. This actually does happen. We've had experience of that as well. Where, we just provided some advice on exactly that point, and you know, it's and there can be, I mean, what was surprising actually, and that was the reluctance of the council to step in actually and say, no, you need to withdraw. And that again can come and back to training, isn't it? It's back to training. You need a strong chair, you need strong officers, and they need to step in and say, no. And that can be really challenging if you've got a very forceful elected member, maybe a very experienced elected member who knows that they should be withdrawing, but for whatever reason, you know, so it can be a very challenging environment to get the right decision for the right reasons, because for all of those politics are at play, and people will not want to be seen to be going against what a platform that they may have created for themselves in the run up to the election. Yeah.
And on the subject of the election, because we have the election in May, it might be useful just to explore the practicalities of what happens after the election. Inevitably, there's quite a lot of a focus on the run up to the election, and we've all had that problem of when's the last planning committee meeting? There's a rush to get things on the agenda. Some things don't make the agenda. So what are the practicalities about, and Johanna, you've had that experience, actually what happens? People have got elected, we know who the councillors are. What happens in terms of the administration being formed, people discovering that they're on the planning committee, the run up to the next planning meeting? Because for those of us not directly involved, there seems to be a big gap, and we're tearing our hair out because we missed that last agenda, and we need to get an application up to the next planning committee, and we're being told there's going to be one before the summer recess, and that's it. It's like,
Yes, yeah, and I that was certainly an eye-opening process, Neil, for me, getting elected and then forming part of the administration. It is a slow, drawn out, and that's not because activity is not happening. There's a huge amount going on, but there is also a huge amount to discuss and to organise. So, the obvious point, and everyone on the call will be very aware of this, I think this is still the case, that there is no council in Scotland that is in outright political control. So that means that across 32 local authorities, administrations of composite groups, and you may also have independent councillors in there as well, are being formed. So that involves conversation, it involves negotiation, it involves sitting down with manifesto commitments and arguing out, discussing through how is that administration going to come together? How is it all going to be agreed? So my experience was literally sitting down with two manifestos and saying, right, this is going to be the administration manifesto. These are going to be the priorities. And only once you, and that may take you 2 or 3 or more sessions just to do that. You've got roles to who's going to be the leader, who's going to be the deputy, who's going to take on what portfolio, who's going to be the provost. You know, so you've got all those roles to negotiate and argue about, and even I was thinking about this earlier, newly elected members thinking about, right, that person's got that really strong interest in housing and planning. They want that portfolio. We know that. But they're a newly elected member. Is there an experienced enough officer there to support that member in exercising that portfolio and doing the job well? So you're not just thinking about who the elected members are and what jobs they're going to do, but also how do they marry up with the officers and the skills that you've got within the council. Then you've got governance. Do you have a committee structure? Do you have a cabinet structure? Some elected members get very exercised about whether it's committees, everything's done by committee, or whether you have a cabinet structure. So there's just a huge amount to go through, and thinking about individual committees like your planning committee, your licensing committee, those quasi-judicial roles. It's not that they are, of course, key critical, but they are just one job in amongst a raft of other things going on. And of course, the critical meeting is the first council meeting that actually sets all of that out, and then everything it's like dominoes, isn't it? Everything then sort of flows on from that. So I'm sorry, that was probably quite a long answer, but
it can be a protracted process. It's not a quick process. It can be, especially as no party clearly who doesn't have an overall control. There's the horse trading and, well, who's going to do the deal with who to actually form the administration, and that can take time. And then, as Johanna quite rightly points out, it's who gets the key roles, how are the committees organised, what structure is going to be organised, and that can be a long process. So you'll often see now this rush, quite rightly, by developers to try and get applications to committee prior to the election. Although if they're highly controversial projects, dare I say, it may be better to wait till after the election, because they become a bit of political football in that respect. But then you could be talking about June for a first planning committee meeting, and if you're not on that, you're into recess, you're into August, and it just goes on and on and on. So it's not a quick process.
And I'm sure, Alex, in terms of thinking about advising clients, developer clients, in terms of when to put applications in, that's absolutely critical, isn't it? Because there is that sensitivity at either side, the election that's just gone. And actually, for most elected members, having a little bit of, I think one thing's critical to say, I can't imagine an elected member getting through in their ward without having some planning issue that they've had to come down on one side or another over. My ward area, I had 2. One was very controversial housing development. The other was in relation to building a school that was over capacity. So there will be key things that councillors, and of course coming in as well, just to go back to Neil's point, as a newly elected member, oh, fantastic, I've just been elected. I said I was going to do this, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to get on and do it. And then you hit this wall of oh my goodness, this is I remember us talking about this when we were forming the administration. This is like shifting a tanker. This is literally like shifting a tanker. It's headed in one direction, and it's so complex. There are so many moving parts. And you only begin to appreciate that, I think, once you are in the door. And of course, I think it's important to say, completely different perspective if you're in opposition. Then I think the frustrations are multiplied by 10, because you really came in, you're enthusiastic, you want to get stuff done, and you realise, oh, we are not going to be forming part of the administration. How difficult is that now going to be for me to achieve the things that I said I would? So yes, sorry, but just to go back to the point about timing of planning applications, I think that's absolutely critical. If you've got something controversial, you want to be hitting the middle of the electoral cycle, don't you? You don't really want to be at either end.
No.
Can imagine.
Sorry,
Alex, on you go.
No, that's fine, Karen. Yeah, sorry. I
was going to say, I can imagine some of the planning consultants in our meeting today will be becoming increasingly stressed listening to this discussion and thinking about those applications that are trying to hit those agendas.
Absolutely. But the interesting thing is a councillor who's maybe campaigned on a local issue doesn't understand if they get onto the planning committee that they can't then object to that, and then getting onto that and then being frustrated when they can't, but because they then have to explain to their constituents why they haven't voted against something because they maybe haven't quite understood their role in that process. And that's quite an interesting scenario.
And someone on the call has raised the point as well, just which is a very good point about the development plan generally, which I think there's that tendency always to be focusing on individual decisions and applications, and that's where there may be a tendency for members to be more interested in those necessarily rather than the plan making process. But of course, for critical decisions that have been set by the development plan, well, as we know, applications obviously can be determined contrary to the plan, but as soon as you start to unpick bit by bit the bits of the plan, it's undermining the development plan, and that may be an issue for new elected members coming in, the extent to which that can realistically happen, or you know, where that is going to leave the council's policy.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
I'm conscious of time, and it's been a very interesting discussion, but I wonder if we could have, just as a sort of bringing it to a close, and we could perhaps cheekily ask both Johanna and Alex for a top tip for people on the call, maybe planning consultants, people who are just generally interested in what's going on in their communities, developers. If you're addressing elected members, perhaps on the occasion of a committee, do you have any top tips for what is the best way to get your message across, regardless of the particular side of the fence that you may be sitting on? How is it best to approach these occasions, and particularly where you may have the magic 5-minute slot to get across what it is that you want to say?
Well, I would say in the first instance, and not to be too cynical, often these issues are decided before the committee is even held by councillors. And I'm sure many developers on this will be familiar with that when they go in and they can see that this is almost a done deal, as it were, not to be too cynical. But the advice I would have is engage early. So engage as early in the process as you can. Don't think, oh gosh, I've got the committee next week, I'll need to start doing some engaging with councillors, community councils, etc. I need to start doing that now. That boat has sailed. I think that the second issue is build up relationships with councillors out with simply that application. So don't just focus on this application. If you're active in the community, if you're doing other things, you know, build up a relationship with them. Try and understand them a bit more. What floats their boat? What are the issues that actually make them tick and that they're going to be interested in that process? And that's the sort of advice I would give in relation to that. But the critical thing is to engage with communities, engage with individuals, and try and address any issues that come up, because often there's very simple wins that you can have through that engagement process that you can deliver back. There's a real tick in the box that you can address in respect to that.
Sounds very sound advice. Anything you would add to that, Johanna, from
no,
your perspective?
I think that's all very good advice.
In a nutshell.
Yeah, and I think with communities, understanding that sometimes the community council, that may be the obvious place to go, but maybe there are other organisations within that community that are very active. They may be in a charity, a urban regeneration company, such as they still exist. You know, there may be other ways into that community to really get the pulse as to what's going on, what are the issues that matter. But certainly engaging early, if you're thinking about putting in an application and you're just doing that engagement weeks or maybe even months before, I think, you know, that there is huge risk there. So engaging early is key. And I think not being scared to approach. And I say that whether you're whether that's within or outside of the council, I think quite often there can be a reluctance to actually approach, go through the door, say, I want to sit down with you, I want to talk to you, and then just being open to the extent that you feel that you can be, being very open and honest about what it is that you're looking for in terms of an outcome. Because quite often I would find myself in conversations thinking, what does this person actually, what is it that they're really after here? And and again, this is just a personal thing, but I would much rather just have that open, honest conversation, because then it's just absolutely clear. Of course, it's then for the elected member to know the code, get the training, and know what they can and can't say, whether they need to be accompanied, etc. But I would say, you know, build up those relationships, have the conversation, and be clear about what it is that you want.
Well, I think that's a very clear message for everyone on the call about relationships, engagement, never starting too early. And as I am also always fond of saying, when it comes to dealing with reporters in the DPA, if you don't ask, you don't get. So that is a good tip to bear in mind as well, I think. But I think that just leaves it for me to thank our guests today, Alex and Johanna, and Neil too, of course. I think we've had a very interesting and lively discussion. It looks like people have enjoyed it, and thanks so much both of you for giving up your time. And if I could say to everyone on the call today, we'd love it if you could join us again on the occasion of our next podcast, as I feverishly find my notes, which is on the 24th of March. It'll be at 4 o'clock again, the usual slot, and we'll be delighted to have Dermot Lawler of Scottish Futures Trust with us on that occasion, when we'll be discussing the place guide. So just remains for me to say goodbye to everyone. Hope you have a good evening, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. So over and out from us.